Hi everyone, it's me again. It is Monday. She's actually doing it on time today. And today I wanted to do a bit of a reflection. Last week was Deaf Awareness Week. It turns out that brought up a lot of stuff for me, and I want to talk about. So I had actually originally planned to do a load of videos talking about tips, if you meet someone who's deaf or if you work with someone who's deaf. And a lot of this might be preached to the choir, especially in the accessibility industry that I work in. It's harmless, like actually just talking about it. And obviously, it being Deaf Awareness Week, no better time to talk about it. What I found myself doing was actually, and having coincidentally watched Sound of Metal, which by the way, if you haven't watched, I recommend you watching. I found that a lot of what I actually wanted to get across was within the deaf community based upon my experiences as a deaf person. Watching Sound of Metal, I was slightly triggered, as in like I was pretty anxious, quite emotional watching it, because there were quite a few things that happened in that film to do with the deaf community that resonated with me and my experience. So just to recap, but I am deaf, severely deaf, and I wear 2 hearing aids, and I have done since I was 18 months old. My mum and dad chose for me to have hearing aids because they wanted me to have access to sounds, to be able to communicate with my 2 older brothers at the time, my grandparents, and so on. All these years down the line, I could not be more grateful having gone down this route, especially now as a deaf-blind adult. Something that really should be mentioned is that with Usher syndrome, especially in this generation, my generation is 26-year-old, we weren't to know that down the line that I were to go blind. At that point, I was just a deaf child, done. But of course, when more problems arose later on, when I got to 12 years old, and that involved not being able to lip read, which for a deaf person is incredibly isolating. Deaf people are so visual. Everything is through the eyes. And we hear with our eyes. Like, that is literally what deaf is. Give us hearing aids, give us cochlear implant, we're still going to open our eyes and use our eyes as much as we can. And it's exhausting. A lot of us really struggle with migraines and, just severe exhaustion, because it is incredibly knackering trying to retain every source of information through your eyes. For me, it was lip patterns, gestures, facial expressions. So when I started to go blind, I was devastating. It's a deaf person's worst nightmare, taking your sight away. Like, it honestly is. And it makes me feel a bit emotional, because it's priceless, having sight to be able to lip read. That's a luxury that I just don't have anymore. Even then, I call it a luxury, but even then it was still hard. It is hard, and triply so being a deaf-blind person now. So the irony is, even though I am deaf-blind and I have 5 degrees vision left, I'm still incredibly visual. So don't push me out of your world. I am still a deaf person who is incredibly visual. Anyone who's been born deaf, you're thrown into that all visual world. Everything, you're retaining it all visually. The emotions there in the face, like, that's how we translate feeling, words, all of it. Like, that doesn't stop overnight. So for us people with Usher syndrome, where we're born into the deaf world, and some of us go down the hearing aid route, the cochlear implant route, some don't do either based on their own choice. And then later on, this blind bombshell that hits us. And for some, that progression happens really slowly, but for others, it can be really quick. For me, in 2 years, I went from being partially sighted to severely sight impaired, politically correct for blind. During what was a really tough time of my life, I was 14, recently diagnosed deaf and blind, and mainstream school that I was at just didn't know what to do with me. Us as a family didn't know what to do, but we looked around other schools. Now the irony was, we found this school for the deaf and academic deaf children, that's what we were told. And I had to do an exam to get in. and I passed, and I did a trial for a week. It was a boarding school, so that was new for me. I remember thinking, oh my goodness, for the first time in my life, I'm going to be like everybody else. And that, for a 14-year-old, is massive. Someone who hadn't experienced that yet, being like everybody else, that was huge. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this is really tough for me to talk about, because there's going to be people out there that will watch this that may have gone to the same school that not believe what I'm saying, because that's kind of how I came away feeling from my few years there. I had teachers and peers make me feel a fraud. I was accused of pretending to be blind. I was accused of wanting special treatment because I wasn't just deaf, I was blind as well. It was like, we're all deaf here. You shouldn't be any more special. All along, I just wanted to be like everybody else. I didn't know sign language. I knew none. No sign language whatsoever. And that was seen with visible disappointment, the fact that I was a deaf person who knew no sign language. And I remember being told by one of the sixth formers, someone said, I can't believe you don't know any sign language. Sad excuse of a deaf person. And I had this old Nokia phone that we all had to hand in our phone to the care staff, it being a boarding school. And I used to call my parents on it on loudspeaker, be like, you're not deaf because you can speak on the phone. Now, I was using loudspeaker and I was only calling my mum and dad, so I knew their voices pretty well, and actually a lot of the time I was mishearing them, but I yearned to hear my parents' voices, especially since not feeling like I belonged after all this time, really wanting to feel like I belonged, really pushed me out. I wasn't one of them, and they made that very, very clear. So I feel like I've already sort of said too much already, because this is such a sensitive topic for me. But going back to Deaf Awareness Week, I wanted to just put out a bit of awareness for people that may not know. So there's a capital D deaf community and then a lowercase d deaf community. And it's kind of this known segregation within the deaf community. So the capital D deaf is more like a culture, it's a way of life, it's a lifestyle. You go to deaf clubs and you know BSL, you don't often use your voice, it's all sign. You have deaf friends, you travel up and down the country to go to deaf events. Deaf world, I was not subjected to till I got to this school. So I was not aware of this kind of life till I got to the school. Just because of that, they didn't really want to know me because I wasn't one of them. The lowercase d deaf are people like myself that born into hearing families, went to mainstream school, more often than not oral. We might know some sign language, but we don't depend on it. It's not our first language. And that's that. So that's literally the two groups of deaf people. And one of the things that I got from Deaf Awareness Week was it was amazing that there were so many voices that were being, raising awareness, putting it to good use, to help the majority of us who are deaf. I found myself trying to scream out to the deaf community rather than the hearing community, all under one umbrella. And it's about time in 2021 that we started educating not just the hearing community, but the deaf community as well. And the Mollywood Trust, so the charity that my family and I set up all those years ago, one of the main reasons we set it up was because we were pushed out. We were pushed out the deaf charities, the deaf community. As soon as I found out I was going blind, that's it, we don't want to know you. And arguably so, my parents were more lost than anything, because for me as a child, I was definitely in denial. I definitely didn't understand the severity of my condition, even though I was coming home black and blue. Didn't want to use a cane, didn't want a guide dog, got one anyway, but didn't accept I needed the dog. It was my parents that were scrambling around for any kind of support and direction, and they weren't given it. As I said, this is why we set up the Mollywood Trust, because even the larger charities for deafblind people like Sense, they're great, but there's a massive umbrella of deafblind people. Usher syndrome, which equates to the largest congenital deaf blindness, kind of ignored. You can see a bit, can hear a bit, you're okay. And what I found really interesting actually from some of the tweets, that very experience is not uncommon. Astounds me how there's this attitude within the charities where like one size fits all attitude, which is archaic, everyone. It's archaic. So I could talk a lot more about my experience. Truth be told, like I'm already feeling pretty anxious about what I've said already, because once I left that school, I received a lot of bullying, a lot of cyberbullying, because there were all these rumours. It was always me trying to be heard, us trying to be heard, trying to get what I was eligible for, what I deserved. And they never made me feel like they had my back, because I wasn't there all the way through as well. That was interesting, because I started later, so because I started in year 9 rather than year 7, I wasn't prioritised, so there was this kind of like loyalty with students that had been there longer. I didn't want this video to be about the negative experiences. What I wanted to do was shine a light on where we need to really improve, take a look at ourselves and improve how we go about these things. So yes, raise awareness of deaf awareness, absolutely. Deaf Blind Awareness Week is also coming up as well, which is great. These weeks are amazing because we use that as a stage. Truth be told, never ever are we all going to be up to speed with all the disabilities in the world, because it's just not going to happen. And what we need to do instead is really take a long hard look at our own attitudes when it comes to what we do in life. And this is why I'm very passionate about inclusion. Be it you're deaf, you're blind, you're deaf, blind, have cerebral palsy, I don't care. I honestly don't care. It's how we treat every individual as an individual. We take all of their experiences into consideration as much as we can. We create fully inclusive products and experiences for every single one of us. And that has to apply within the deaf community. It has to. And I just have to say, like, whilst I'm here, the most horrendous experiences that have happened to me has been whilst trying my absolute best to fit in with the deaf community. I killed myself to do that. I did. I was so poorly. I hurt myself. I cut my voice off, picked up sign language. I couldn't see for the life of me what people were saying to me with 5 degrees vision, but I was signing to them because I wanted to fit in. I wanted so badly to be like the others. And there were times where I did have a nice time, where I actually felt like these people were looking at me like one of them. Then everything I did thereafter, it would go against me. From that school, I don't have any friends from that school anymore, which hurts, because I have friends from primary school who have lifelong friends from their secondary schools. But schooling for me is such a touchy topic, because it was a time that was really, really sad, where I really tried to change and erase every bit of Molly to fit in. And it was the most excluding experience. And it's an experience that sadly isn't uncommon, especially for those of us with Usher syndrome. So I know people that are profoundly deaf and they've been in the capital D culture, signing, then they find out they're going blind. And whilst they've still got sight, they're able to fit in with that. And some people can be understanding, they step back and they sign within the window. But then as soon as it's night time, or they need a bit of guidance, we're seen as burdens, because we have that slight extra need. And when you think how tight-knit that community is, and I know you lot who have been associated or within the community, if you know the deaf community, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's tight-knit, and it's lovely if you're in that, but imagine being in it and then kicked out. It's heart-wrenching. I really hope that what I said today hasn't insulted anybody, because that's absolutely not what I want to do. But maybe just opened your eyes a little bit, excuse the pun. I'm only an expert in my own experiences. I'm not saying that what I've experienced is the same as everybody else. That said, the few of the things I have talked about have been similar for a lot of people with Usher syndrome. And I just feel that I'm in a position to talk about it, so I will. And hopefully by doing that, other people feel like they can talk about it too.